Hi, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 12, which is going to focus on risk assessment. Risk management is a process that is involved in the anticipation, the recognition, and the appraisal of risk, and the actions that are taken to eliminate or reduce the risk and the threat of harm. In order to conduct risk assessment, identification of risk must occur. There are multiple categories of risk. So the whole idea here behind a risk assessment is to create an objective analysis of organizations and their entire protective system and its vulnerabilities. So risk assessment is going to go into a corporation or a hospital or a school. It's going to evaluate the physical environment. It's going to evaluate the personnel. It's going to evaluate how they function and say, here's where you guys are really strong on security. Here's where you're weak and vulnerable. And here are some ideas of how you can strengthen up those vulnerabilities so that you are more protected, whether it's protected from an attack or protected from a data breach, et cetera, is going to depend on the type of organization that you're working for and what their focus is. So the first category of risk is called dynamic risk, and these are threat conditions that are subject to change over time. They can increase or decrease. So for example, natural disasters are a really good example of dynamic threat risk. Wildfires out west, there's sort of a wildfire season. When it's not wildfire season, that dynamic risk is going to go down low. When it is wildfire season, it's going to increase. There's also static risk, and that's the opposite of dynamic. Static risk is risk that is constant and unchanging. It can usually be predicted in advance, which allows for mitigation through avoidance strategies. So there are certain things that are always going to be present that are risk factors. So for example, in nuclear facilities, the cooling towers always have to stay cool and provide cool water for the spent nuclear rods. If they don't, those nuclear rods get too hot and it starts to melt down, which is a huge catastrophe. But that's ever present. That's always going to be there. If there's no water, there's going to be a huge incident. So they can predict what will happen. There will be a meltdown, so we have to make sure there's always water. They can create a plan to mitigate, minimize, and eliminate that risk. Keep the rods cool. There's also pure risk. So situations where there's potential for injury, harm, or loss, where there's no benefit to be gained. Natural disasters are a good example of this. So people who have organizations that operate in flood zones are a good example where there is pure risk. There's no potential for gain for anyone when a flood happens. But it's possible when you live in a flood area that there are going to be extreme rains. There's always potential for harm without any benefits. Speculative risk is another category where there's potential for benefit or loss depending on the consequence of the activity or inactivity. So gambling in the stock market are examples of speculative risk. Operational risk is an organization's potential for loss as a result of deficiencies in the system's reliability or integrity. The BP Deepwater Horizon spill is a really good example of operational risk. There were deficiencies in their system that resulted in a mass oil leak that caused excessive damage to the environment, and it ultimately cost BP tons and tons of money, not only to clean it up, to fix the security vulnerabilities, but also in terms of sanctions, lawsuits, etc. There's also legal risk. This is going to be violations of laws, rules, and regulations. So failing to follow legally binding rules can result in tort liability, loss of finances, and in some cases, criminal liability if you were not following OSHA regulations. Finally, there's reputational risk. This is when an organization loses its affiliation as a positive organization based on their impact, or excuse me, based on their business practices. This is going to negatively impact their profitability when they lose reputation. A really demonstrative example of this would be, I think it was maybe 10 years back when an executive at Netflix came out and said, well, very publicly, he made a comment that we're going to raise prices and it doesn't matter. People will stay with us no matter what. We're the only game in town. They'll pay what we tell them to pay. Well, it caused massive reputational loss. People were disgusted by that attitude. Consumers did not like it, so they left in droves. And I believe at the time they lost something like 25% of their customer base overnight. So that's an example of reputational risk. There are risk assessment techniques, and those allow you to develop an understanding of the organization, and the assessment allows you to identify human, physical, and informational assets that cause risk or that are at risk. The first thing you want to do is identify loss risk events and vulnerabilities. You want to also determine the probability of those less risk events. How likely is this potential situation to happen? And what's the frequency? If it does happen, will it happen once? Will it happen more than once? Will it happen every year, etc.? You want to develop options to prevent loss or to mitigate loss. And you want to study the feasibility of implementing each prevention and risk mitigation approach. Is it feasible? Is it something that can actually be done? Is it something that costs a lot of money? If it costs too much, can it be done once? Can it be done more than once? Can it be done consistently? Or can you not afford it at all? And finally, you want to perform that cost benefit analysis of implementing risk prevention and risk mitigation. If we take the time and the manpower and the money and the resources to do that, to implement this risk prevention, will it do what we want it to do? Is the cost worth the benefit? You also want to assign risk levels. So the first is going to be a question of vulnerability, which is the security flaws or weaknesses that can be exploited by a threat, which can lead to damage, injury, or harm. You want to identify the probability, which is the likelihood of the occurrence. There's a spectrum here that starts at 0 and ends at 100%. Rarely is probability either 0 or 100%. It usually falls somewhere in between. And it's important to determine the likelihood, the probability of that happening. And finally, criticality is determining the importance of the asset or achieving the mission of organizational success and how damage or loss to that asset could adversely impact the organization. Even if the risk of the negative event is low, it's a low probability, this is not something that should be dismissed. This can be a fatal error where you do a risk analysis, you do a risk assessment, say, okay, hey, this situation over here is highly unlikely, but just because it's highly unlikely doesn't mean it can't cause a large amount of damage. It also means that just because it's unlikely doesn't mean it's impossible. It's unlikely, but it could still happen. So it shouldn't be dismissed outright. There are risk management techniques that can be implemented. So the first is going to be risk elimination. So efforts to reduce risk through elimination. Total elimination is often very difficult to achieve. So for example, if there's a risk, of fire, you can institute fire safety, but you can't remove every flammable material from a building. That would include all the people that work there, right? Elimination isn't possible, but you can eliminate certain things. Okay, there's also risk mitigation, which is taking steps to reduce impact of loss. So sticking with our example of fire, you can take steps to reduce loss by having fire extinguishers all over the building, instituting fire alarms so that people can be aware of it earlier on, stop it before it spreads, introducing sprinkler systems to stop the fire in its path, things of that nature. Risk avoidance is avoiding risky things. So sticking again with our example of fire, you want to avoid risky things like no smoking in the building, no smoking maybe outside of the building within 20 feet, not having open flames in the building, etc. Risk reduction are activities designed to reduce consequences and the likelihood of any loss. So things like, again, staying with our fire example, having a plan if there is a fire. So exiting the building, identifying people in the event of a fire and the need to exit the building, who needs, we should have a couple of people who are responsible for checking offices and bathrooms and making sure they're empty to make sure that there's less harm, that everybody's out of the building. Who's the person responsible for calling 911? Because if everybody thinks somebody else is going to do it, then nobody does it, right? So those are ways of risk reducing by having that plan, identifying people responsible for different things. Risk spreading is compartmentalization of valuables to mitigate loss. So for example, maybe don't keep storage all on one site, storage of data all on one site. If there's a fire, you lose all of your backup storage, so have multiple sites. Next is risk transfer. This is going to be shifting the burden onto someone else, and the most common form of risk transfer is going to be insurance, that I pay monthly or annual insurance premiums so that, if there is a fire or some sort of catastrophe and I physically lose all of these items, I will be reimbursed to rebuild it. Risk acceptance is simply the decision to accept a certain amount of risk. We all do this on a daily basis in our lives. Of course, everybody would like to completely eliminate risk, but we know that it's not entirely possible. So we all accept a certain amount of risk every day when we step outside of our houses, right? There's the risk that you could be hit by a car, or that you could be in a car accident, or you could be struck by lightning, right? You accept a certain amount of risk. You try to mitigate it. You tend to accept risk that is unlikely, less likely. But this happens in organizations as well. And it's usually, they determine how much risk they can accept, which is going to be based on cost. Is it too costly to protect against? Or, what's an acceptable amount of damage that we can incur and still make a profit? So a really good example there is the amount of risk acceptance in the retail world, that there's always going to be a certain amount of shoplifting. There's always going to be a certain amount of materials, items, and profit that's lost to shoplifting. How much, what percentage can we tolerate before we start to lose money on profit? That's risk acceptance. Developing contingency plans are always a great idea. So this is, creating plans in play and having them in place, educating people in your personnel on the plans, maybe even running through some practice, versions of the plans, so that if there is an issue, if there's some kind of problem, whether it's a fire or there's workplace violence or something, that people know what they're supposed to do. There's a plan in place and they know exactly what they're supposed to do because they've been trained on it and they've actually run through it. They've done a few dry runs. It's important to determine recovery time objectives so that if there is some kind of an incident that interferes or shuts down the organization, you need to identify the activities that will need to take place and the time necessary to replace those activities, and to determine when your organization will have capability again as a result of the event. And of course, that's followed by determining the resumption of activities. And these are going to be activities taken to restore the organization to pre-event conditions.